before we get started.
Hi, everyone. I apologize for the background noise. My internet is not working at my house, so I had to come to a cafe. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yes.
wonderful. So I thought I would just share my screen with you because we have a special announcement. So Dr. Makoni, me, and Dr. Mokwena have been working on this handbook called the Rutledge Handbook of Language in the Global South. We've been working on it for 3.5 years. We are very, very excited about the handbook. And it combines, I'll show you, can you see the other? Okay, great. So it combines 31 different chapters from authors all around the world. We focus on issues of decolonization. We focus on Southern epistemologies and theories of the Global South, or what we're calling the Global South, plural. We focus on social and applied linguistics with an added focus on the academy. And we try to get further nuanced understandings of global language scholarship. One of the exciting parts of this book as well is that we have what we're calling interludes with seasoned, well-known scholars, including Busi Makoni, who's on the call, where we ask questions in a less formal way about their work, about their connections between their work and issues within the Global South, et cetera. So here is the table of contents. It's really exciting to see. We hope that you are interested in it. We hope that you purchase the book. There is the actual paper book, and there's also, I'll just do this so you can see all of the wonderful contributions. And so there also is, here we go, an ebook as well. So if you are interested in ordering the book, or if you're interested in learning more about how the book came to be, we would love to share it with you. I am putting here in the chat the link to the book, so you can look at it more. And that's it. We're really excited about it. Do you have any questions before I turn over this forum to Joseph? Okay, wonderful. Thank you so much for all of it. And of course, working with Dr. Makoni is always a joy. So it's been really an amazing adventure. So I hope you all enjoy.
Congratulations. It looks amazing.
Thank you, Anissa. Thank you so much.
All right. Thank you so much, Anna. All right, we'll move on to our official introduction of Professor Errington. So thank you so much for sharing. We're all excited to read. So today we have Professor Errington who'll talk with us about living with lingua francas, English in Indonesia and Indonesian. So Dr. Joe Errington has a PhD from the University of Chicago and has taught linguistic anthropology at Yale University for 40 years, where he has also been active in Southeast Asian studies. Aside from a broad historical review of linguist work in colonial contexts, he has published on sociolinguistic dynamics in several parts of Indonesia. So this talk draws on the newest of these, a book forthcoming from Oxford University Press, Other Indonesians, Nationalism in an Unnative Language. So thank you so much for joining us, Professor Errington. The floor is now yours.
Thank you. I take it you can hear me? Am I loud enough?
Yes.
Okay. Let me see if I can do it twice in a row. Can you see this screen? Can you? Yes?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you. Well, I'm delighted and honored to have this opportunity, well, to get acquainted with some of you and reacquaint with old friends who also have PhDs from the University of Chicago. And when I was thinking about what to do, there's a kind of advantage and disadvantage to giving a talk on the heels of the finishing of a project. And I should say, for truth in advertising that I think of myself as an Indonesianist, as a sociolinguist of Indonesia. And the work on colonial linguistics was something I did, well, let's put it this way. If I had been able to get to the field during that period of time, I probably would have done something more like what you're going to hear today. But in thinking about how I can best use the time to speak to your interests, I'm not flogging the book, you understand. This is just what the cover looks like. I thought what I would do is take the book and sort of turn the themes inside out, which is to say, I'm going to skip over a lot of the empirical variationist stuff and foreground what might be the larger themes, making a real, maybe misguided effort, but a real honest effort to speak to the larger themes I take to be of central interest to all of you. So one of the things I've tried to do in this book is frame the Indonesian situation in ways that speak to larger issues of globalization, and a way of doing that I found was to consider an argument that was made by the Komarovs, which I'm sure you're familiar with. I don't know how you react to it. It's at least useful for me in their article and books called Theory from the South, or How Euro-America is Evolving Toward Africa. So they say that it seems as though nations of the Northern Hemisphere are evolving southward, so to speak. And I don't feel qualified to judge the validity or applicability of that, but it did raise for me the question of sociolinguistic dynamics in the global North in comparison with Indonesia as one part of the global South. So the way I would like to organize this today is introduce as a key theme the way that nationalisms presuppose native speakership and what it is that ideas of native speakership do for the legitimacy of languages and through languages of nations. Because Indonesia is, as the subtitle of the book indicates, highly unusual in this respect because it is a lingua franca, but a national language. It has no native speakers, which immediately calls into question, what do you mean by native speaker? And that's what I'd like to try and do, as it were, today. So I'm going to talk about Indonesian as a national lingua franca and a possible source of, to quote the Komarovs again, insight into the workings of the world at large, and a model for newer, what they call newly imagined communities of difference, because I think that's a good way of describing what Indonesia has become, or if I may call it that, the Indonesian success story. So I am going to try and foreground three themes. One is how languages without native speakers can take on both emblematic and interactional values, and how they can do this through a plurality of vernaculars, which is the situation in Indonesia among a hugely multilingual citizenry. But the third thing that I want to shoehorn in, because it's very much part of the Indonesian scene, as others, is the presence of English as a distinctly global rather than national lingua franca. So those are the three things I'm going to try and dash through. I am going to skip all the data. I'm going to simply assert things that may irritate you or intrigue you, and hope that we can use discussion time for me to try and remediate what I say. So the place I want to start is with ideologies that legitimize or distinguish national languages in, as let's call it, the model of the monoglot nation of typically the global North. And here I'm drawing on work by Gall and Woolard of some 20 years ago, where they distinguish between the ideology of the anonymity of the national language and the authenticity of the national language. And in her more recent work, Kit Woolard describes these as the ways that national languages become, on one hand, vehicles of communication belonging to no one in particular, and so in principle equally available to all. That is to say, they are neutral and therefore authoritative. And on the other hand, they have very different qualities as because they are deeply rooted in social and geographic territory. Now, it seems to me that the way these two otherwise skewed ways of thinking about languages are both enabled by a particular conception of what it is to be a speaker of a language and what is usually called a native speaker. It seems to me that an ideology of native speakership is a key naturalizer of both ideologies at the same time. It is a guarantee of authenticity insofar as a language competence is a personal attribute. It is part of one's coming of age as a social being. It is biographical, existential, and it is inalienable. In that critical period of language acquisition, as the linguists sometimes like to say. But native speaker is also a mode of social aggregation. It is a way of joining people as native speakers of the same language, irregardless of whatever variation there is in individual competences. So on one hand, ideologically, to be a speaker of a native language is to have share a kind of linguistic fatedness, to use Anderson's terms, with those who came before one, those who come after one. This is what allows nationalisms to become a way of transcending oneself. That's his argument. But what he doesn't point out, and that is just as important, is that when the category native speaker is associated with one spoken variety, then linguistic and social hierarchies come together in ways that the concept helps to naturalize. And that is why these two ideologies together, through the idea of the native speaker, ground what Willard calls a sense of a language's sociolinguistic naturalness, the ways it is used and valued as if it were independent of willful human intervention and naturally and directly corresponding to a social state of affairs. So, I mean, a lot of the native speaker is not what it used to be in academic circles, certainly, and is changing rapidly now, but I just wanted to quickly get that out there in order to look quick glance at ways that in the global north, and here I'm going to focus on Western Europe, the ideologies of anonymity and authenticity are becoming dissociated as the category native speaker comes into question or becomes contested. So very, very quickly, and this is the last 5 pages of the book, but I'm putting it up front. Willard develops her insights on the basis of her study of Catalan in the Catalonian independence movement, where as a matter of public political discourse, there's been a dissociation of Catalan versus Castilian as authentic versus anonymous. Proponents of Catalan's independence, Catalonia's independence, claim its privileged authenticity relative to Castilian, its deep roots in the territory and the history of the people of the region. The Unionists, on the other hand, see it not as authentic, but as provincial, as limited, as incapable of use for public authoritative discourse, unlike anonymous Castilian, which is portable not just across the territory of Spain, the peninsula, but in Hispanophone nations as well. And she goes in great and interesting detail into the ways these two ideologies are banged against each other in public, official, or authoritative discourse. But she's more interested in what she calls young bilinguals who have come up speaking both languages in this environment, have weakened senses of sociolinguistic naturalism, which enables them to speak in accord with what she calls goal-oriented understandings of personal and community authenticity as project rather than origin. And this is what I want to say is something you can see going on in Indonesia as well, but for different reasons. So there's one example of the dissociation. Another much more widespread and fairly well documented empirically is the de-standardizing of national languages of Western Europe. If you look at the 2011 volume edited by Christensen Coupland, this is the SLICE program, right? The Standard Languages program. So I'm picking here Dutch just because Dutch was the colonial language of Indonesia, where we see what researchers are calling a radical weakening or abandoning of the standard ideology, a reluctance to play by the rules of such standards, a downward relaxation of the standard leading to the emergence of regional and social varieties. And so I would say an acknowledgement of the variation among varieties of natively spoken Dutch, where one would have once had standard versus non-standard, one now has variation that is countenanced relative to locales, relative to communities. Very quickly, because I'm counting on people being familiar with some or all of these, language revitalization movements are producing a kind of speaker that eludes the native non-native distinction, and that people like Hualar and O'Rourke are calling new speakers, right? That is to say, they do not acquire the language during that critical period of language acquisition, but they can acquire it with fluency nonetheless. And this is part of what they say is needed for a post-national linguistics. The last thing I'll quickly mention going on in Europe are the conditions of global mobility. They're producing conditions of super diversity. Again, I'm assuming that to one degree or other, we're all familiar with the literature that is rapidly developed on this, right? Where one speaks of truncated repertoires rather than knowledge of language systems. So Blomert and Rampton are probably the beginners of this. I'm just going for 4 ways that the category native speakership has lost its naturalness, has become displaced in Western Europe. And I do this so that I can say, well, perhaps what is now destabilized in Europe is analogous to what happened as the Indonesian language became the stable, fully recognized language of its nation, which is very quickly what I'm going to turn to now. This is the second part of the talk. The idea is that Indonesia might offer an alternative model for thinking about language and national identities. So just to try and make this thing look as if it's coherent, first, I'm going to give you, let's call it a macro sketch of the way Indonesian has developed through an overt split between ideologies of anonymity and authenticity. This is now enabling of the Indonesian language rather than in some way eroding its efficacy. Then I'm going to pass over the guts of the book with just a very quick sketch of some of the vernacular Indonesians which are in use every day among some of the educated residents of towns where I and my team did research, and then touch lastly on the kind of ambiguous relation between Indonesian and English as national and global lingua francas, both associated with spheres of modernity. So those are the 3 steps I'm now very rapidly going to dash through. So Indonesia is 5,000 kilometers from the tip of Sumatra over to the border with Papua New Guinea. Depending on who's counting, 700 or 750 ethnic languages scattered across hundreds or thousands of islands. Not the most obvious candidate for a unitary nation in the world. And the site of what has sometimes been called by, was called by Joshua Fishman in 1976, the Indonesian miracle. Of course, he was looking at it as a nation that had overcome the problems of developing nations. That Indonesian was a solution to the linguistic heterogeneity, which was perceived to be an impediment to proper development. So I'll talk about it in 3 stages, very roughly periodized in this way. So the way Indonesian was established, the way it came into being, the ways it was disseminated or diffused, as Ravinathat and Cohen put it, and then what's happened in the last 20 years or so. So very quickly, and again, I'm hoping if you've looked at the colonial linguistics book, you've seen this before. The Netherlands East Indies bureaucracy at a certain point could not function without a single standard codified language. The Dutch did not want to give their native language to the natives, so they commissioned the establishment of a literate standard Malay, general cultured Malay, understood to not be spoken anywhere natively in the archipelago. And this was taught to both Dutch and native government employees. in the government schools. The first generation of native employees, the subaltern elite in this, rapidly took over ideas of nationalism along with the drive for independence from the Dutch. And they took over the idea of a national language by renaming this general cultured Malay as Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia, in an event still celebrated every year to this day called the Pledge of the Youth, one land, one people, one language. At this point, what they called Indonesian was spoken by perhaps 2% of the population of the Netherlands East Indies. But among the elites, it circulated and was used very rapidly. This was a multi-ethnic elite after all, so Indonesian was their common language. And in 1945, at the end of the Japanese occupation and the interregnum, before the Dutch could come back in, it was used to declare independence by Sukarno. Sukarno was president for the next 20 years, but a stagnating economy and a corrupt political system ended in 1965 with a military coup, which ushered in the period of diffusion, or the engineering, as they like to say, of the national language. The military killed at least 1 million people to underwrite the regime that it then established, making it clear to everyone that they were not going to brook any opposition. And they instituted a top-down program of national development along the lines very much of modernization theory as it was being propounded in the global north. And Indonesian was the language which was not just crucially instrumental for this program, but symbolic for its goals, for modernity. You can't see my scare quotes. Modernity, national modernity was where they were headed. Through government offices, through schools which were established on almost every island and elementary schools in almost every village, young Indonesians were, say, inducted into knowledge of literate Indonesian. Okay, so through books primarily, but also through mass media controlled by the government, the standard literacy-based Indonesian was being superposed on all those communities, on all those islands, and all those speakers of all those languages, everywhere in the absence of native speakers. So there's an interesting period early on when there's controversy about what kind of spoken Indonesian are we going to teach? What counts as a standard Indonesian accent? Long story short, they came up with no real answer. And people adjusted to context is a nice way of putting it. And this was successful. It's hard by any standard to deny that Indonesian is now the language of the great majority of Indonesians. So quick and dirty, here is a map indicating that more than 90% of all Indonesians speak it. If you want, we can come back. I can point out the places where the rates are lower, which of course tend to be up in the mountains and inland, but that's another story. I mean, let's just take it for granted this was a success. Also, we won't worry about what it means to be, when you take a census form and you ask somebody, do you speak Indonesian? And what they mean when they say yes is another question. So what enabled this success story was, let's call it a bilingual diglossic norm, okay? High Indonesian, called good and true, yang baik dan benar, radically anonymous, literacy-based, in a quasi-proprietary relation to the state and its agents on one hand, and then low ethnic languages, mostly non-standardized and oral. Sometimes they could be called ancestral codes, borrowing that term from Woodbury, because the association of them is always with the locale, with the ancestors, with the past. The implication always being that as we move into an Indonesian future, we're going to move into Indonesian. And these are judged to be native, the operative word is asli, to demarcated territories and residents. So the idea is that high public formal Indonesian stands in the same relation everywhere to every ethno-linguistic language, every region, and every segment of the population that speaks those languages and lives in those regions. Enter now what you could call the era of decentralization. The New Order regime, with a little nudge from the International Monetary Foundation, falls in 1998. There is a devolution of power from the national capital, Jakarta, to the regions. There is less government control of the media. And now non-standard varieties of Indonesian begin to surface in public venues and discourses. They are gaining greater visibility and circulating more widely in the nation at large. And this is the situation in which I was doing the research I'm now going to very quickly summarize. And this is going to be a regional micro view, if you will, of urban dynamics in the 2 of the 3 towns where we did research. What they have in common is the creation of a kind of ideological blind spot for the dominant ideology of anonymous Indonesian. And that blind spot was created by the development program of the New Order itself, because it rested on infrastructures of mobility, of people, of goods, of capital. And that meant heightened patterns, this should sound familiar, circular and permanent migration between urban centers and rural peripheries, such that by 2006, half of all Indonesians live in towns with populations of between 50,000 and 500,000. This is in addition to the towns which are 500,000 and up to say 12 million, which is what the Jakarta area is now home to. And what this means is that urban centers become heteroglot because people are coming from different regions as speakers of different ethnic languages. And what this means is that when they converge on those regional urban centers, there is now a need for a means of communication that is not the standard language, which belongs to the state, and which is not the language of any one region. And it is in this situation that vernacular varieties of Indonesian come into being. They partake of Indonesian, but are licensed by the fact that Indonesian is a language without native speakers. So you get these vernacular or colloquial registers, which sometimes are called everyday Indonesian or salad language, but which are ideologically residual with regard to ideas about what Indonesian is, what it's for, what it stands for. But these are the languages of everyday life, and that makes them the languages of urban modernity. Lexical, morphological, syntactic, and discourse markers from native varieties of Malay, as well as Indonesian and international languages. And this is the guts of the book that I'm passing over to give you a very short version of A Tale of Two Cities. So one is Kupang, which is way down here in the southeasternmost part of Indonesia. And the other is that this is the capital of the province Nusa Tenggara Timur. And up here is Pontiana, capital of West Kalimantan. So this is the western coast of the island of Borneo. So very quickly, what has been happening in these 2 towns? Kupang is a town where people spoke a Malay Creole as early as the early 17th, late 17th century. The Dutch built a fort there to keep an eye on the Portuguese. People from all over the archipelago and Europe came in. There was a pidginized version of Malay, which became Creolized. And when Dutch interest in the area became less, then it became this administrative backwater where nothing much happened until about 1980, when the New Order used it as a staging ground for its invasion of East Timor. All of a sudden, massive amounts of money and personnel descend on the capital of this province, which is Kupang. And over 40 years, its population grows from about 80,000 to 500,000. And these are all people, most people are coming from other islands in the province where are spoken 75 different languages. So the language which emerges from this is a language which some call Kupang Malay, if you're a linguist and you're interested in history and structure, but which is known locally as the Kupang language, Bahasa Kupang, which points to the fact that it is not part of any ethnic region. It is part of an urban center. It has become uniform, if not standardized, through rapid coinization. People who come to the town from outside are put under various kinds of informal but very effective pressure to eliminate transfer effects from their native languages. If they want to be seen as people who are sophisticated and urban, they have to learn to get rid of their ethnic accent. So they all converge on a single variety. This vernacular, moreover, is used for virtually every topic by virtually everybody in virtually all contexts. And this is possible among educated speakers who are the focus of our work because they very easily assimilate standard Indonesian and English lexical material into vernacular grammatical constructions, phrasings. That's what I'm not going to talk about. The result is that this vernacular has become a regional lingua franca. It is kind of the regional counterpart to standard Indonesian as the national lingua franca. And as people circulate between the city and peripheries of the province, they take this variety of Kupang Malay or Bahasa Kupang with them, so that it's being acquired now even by illiterate people on other islands, who may not in fact speak standard Indonesian at all, and may in fact have little sense of the difference between the language of Kupang and the language of the nation. So languages that are being endangered in this province, by the way, are not being endangered by standard Indonesian. They're being endangered by this vernacular. So that's what's happening in Kupang. Standard Indonesian is a resource for speakers, but it is not a competence that everybody always uses by any means. Turn now to Pontiana very quickly. This is an area, the coast of which counts as ethnic Malay, but inland from the coast are people who are now called Dayaks, which used to mean people upriver, but now has become an ethnic term. Speakers of related but clearly distinct languages. The town of Pontiana was founded by ethnic Malays before the Dutch came along and basically installed a community of ethnic Chinese speakers of Teochew to handle the economy, which keyed to goods flowing in and out of the interior of Borneo along the rivers through Pontiana. So from the very start, ethnic Malays and ethnic Chinese were in an uneasy relationship with each other in this town. The more the empire grew, the more exploitation there was of the Dayaks living in the interior. I mean, if you know about the problem with palm oil plantations now, that is just the very latest stage in 150 years of incursions onto Dayak territory. What I'm trying to emphasize here is that although Pontiana is comparable in size with Kupang, it is ethnically diverse in ways that are politically and economically salient. Chinese, Malays, and Dayaks all have different backgrounds, different agendas, different niches. And this is leaving out migrants from other islands, of which there are thousands here as well. So this is much more a plural society than Kupang is. And what we see here is that people who live in Kupang who are not Malay or not Chinese, they could be Dayaks, Javanese from other islands, when they speak with others in town every day, they selectively adopt some Malay, what would count otherwise as local ethnic native Malay speech sounds in their otherwise fluent standard Indonesian speech. So they have what I like to call Bi-Accentual registers of speech. Sometimes one, sometimes the other, all mixed up. The value of these registers, as negligible as they are for the people who use them, is that they serve interaction across lines of ethnic difference. If I am a Dayak and I am talking to a Malay and we are not in a formal context, I will use some version of this language as a way of marking myself as urban and sophisticated, but I will not do it so much that I sound like a Malay. I kind of try and walk the line between those two things. And this has given rise to what some people call not Malay or Pontiana Malay, but the language of Pontiana, with the same construction that's used to talk about the language of Kupang, that is Bahasa Pontiana, not an ethnic language, not a regional language, but an urban language. Now, if you're a Malay living in Pontiana, on the other hand, you too, with outsiders, non-Malays, will adopt this bi-accentual manner of speech. At the same time, you're going to avoid certain accent features that increasingly are oriented to class. If you use them, you sound like you're rural, like you're a bumpkin. And urban people especially, and especially middle-class people, avoid those. At the same time, these Malays, they have a strong ideological sense of the difference between standard Indonesian and ethnic Malay, but they have a very weak practical sense of it. I mean, I had this happen all the time because my Indonesian is pretty standard. And within 2 or 3 minutes of talking with me, Malays would start slipping into their Malay accents. They were not used to speaking standard Malay all the time. It didn't make my research any easier. So what is common to these two dynamics is a bracketing of the diglossic norm, the national ethnic distinction, an easy assimilation of high Indonesian and global English to low local vernacular manners of speech, and vernacular competences that are acquired and used as a means of engagement in the modernity, not just of the nation, but urban scenes of modernity, right? The modernity of the nation is abstraction. You engage with it in particular locales, which are urban. So what I'm dashing towards, right, is the way that Indonesian, being unnative, licenses two different varieties of the language. Kupangs is increasingly associated with this emergent provincial identity. Pontianats is there as a means of effacing, but not erasing, what are durable, salient ethnic differences, ethno-political differences. Both represent the development of Indonesian, but they are different varieties of language in different situations, and the people who speak them all think of themselves as speakers of Indonesian. So, two morals of the story, if you will. One is the paradox, which is the Indonesian paradox is in fact the national motto. And people who know Sanskrit may recognize a couple of the words in the national motto, which is taken from Old Javanese, Bhinneka Tunggal Ika, most literally translated, many that, one that, usually translated into English is unity in diversity. What that usually is taken to mean in language is that there are many ethnic languages and one Indonesian. But the story I'm telling is about a national language which, because it has no native speakers, legitimizes a plurality of Indonesians itself. There are many Indonesians which are spoken locally, which are recognized to be coexistent with the language of unity, which is the standard but not native national language. And this is the source, I would like to say, of Indonesians' values as an emblem of unity for a multilingual nation. I speak it, I've spoken it since I was a child, but I do not count as a native speaker. But it also enables the language's practical values in vernacular engagements, which vary as do people's biographies and communities. It seems to me that this is especially clear in the Indonesian case because of the fact that the ideology of native speakership has no hold on uses or values of the native language. So here is perhaps a model for what might be going on elsewhere in the world, perhaps in the global north, where de-standardization of various kinds is going on. A loss of sociolinguistic naturalism, if you will. The second moral has to do with the modernities and the anxiety of global English. I've mentioned several times how easily English is assimilated into otherwise very colloquial, very vernacular speech. And I want to say that that is, on one hand, because it is a lingua franca like Indonesian. It is, like Indonesian, understood to be a means, an instrument for topical engagements with modernity. It is, like Indonesian, easily incorporated into vernacular grammar and speech. And it too is acquired and used and valued in the absence of native or exemplary speakers. I can talk all about this more if you want later. But that similarity of being a lingua franca also engenders anxiety, and I won't talk about this at length. It's in the complaint tradition of Indonesian, because being anonymous, Indonesian is comparable with English by metrics of efficiency, portability, and so on. And for when people are thinking about Indonesian in the world at large, this engenders what the Philippine nationalist Jose Rizal called specters of comparison. That is, when you speak Indonesian and English enters into it, you begin to worry about whether Indonesian is just a lesser version of English, which leads to repeated government efforts and private efforts to keep Indonesian and English separate, and to lead to constant worries in public about, are young people not learning Indonesian because they're learning English? Well, they are learning Indonesian, but it's vernacular Indonesian. That's another story. The other anxiety that's created by this is the mode of acquisition of English, where Indonesian is acquired in institutions controlled by the state for the entire citizenry. English is, as it were, a private commodity. You have to be able to pay to take the lessons, and this is leading to emergent class-based linguistic hierarchies. How fluent is your real English? And this then is a mark of globalization taking hold locally in biographies and communities as well. And this too, the presence of English in this way, at least in the latter case, is very clear in some situations, but maybe it's clearer because of this commonality of the languages as lingua francas. And I'm dashing here towards the end. So what I'm trying to suggest is that because Standard Indonesian is radically anonymous or unnative, as I sometimes call it, it is possible it licenses and is a resource for the creation of vernacular varieties of the language, which in fact become the languages of urban modernity. These are the ways one engages with the modern nation, in particular urban locales, and with others, even though they are ideologically erased or invisible, if you will. So on one hand, the anonymous standard is serving superordinately in the national sphere as a resource for this. But when you think about modernity, not just as a national, but a global sphere, then you are dealing not just with the anonymous standard, but with English. And at that point, this relationship comes into play. The relation is heightened by the fact that in Indonesia, they are both spoken in the absence of native speakers. So what I've tried to emphasize are possible consequences of the erosion of the ideology in the native speaker that might happen elsewhere as they've happened in Indonesia. A loss of ideologies of what Rutledge calls sociolinguistic naturalism. That is to say, projects, languages become parts of projects rather than given entities. It means that other than standard language varieties can take on new values that are not entirely covert. And it could be that the global lingua franca, to the degree it is perceived as a lingua franca, not a language of empire, may be more open to assimilation to local vernaculars. This is an argument that echoes those made by Widdowson, for instance, in the 90s about English as a resource which can be used in indefinitely many ways in indefinitely many contexts. And I think that's 40 minutes, and I'll stop there. Quick. These are the folks who were involved in the research project that I have polarized for you today. And having put their names up there, I'll leave it at that and take any questions or comments. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Errington, for your presentation. I'll let Professor Makoni get us started with the Q&A session.
Yes. Thank you very much, Professor Errington. I have a couple of questions. The first one is a very general one. It deals much more with you and your career. You had begun to talk about it. Some of your earliest works that I encountered were on colonial linguistics. So what I'm interested in, for example, is the intellectual route that you have traveled from colonial linguistics to the current, to your current project on Indonesia and nationalism in Indonesia.
Mhm.
What have been the signposts and what have been the blind areas that you have encountered as you moved across? Could you have started, for example, from the current project on Indonesia, going backwards to colonial linguistics, or the route was only going to be from colonial linguistics to the Indonesian project?
The project I've been talking about would not be what it is without having done the book on colonial linguistics. But the book on colonial linguistics was something, I thought of it as working outside my field when I started it. But as I worked on it, and although they are not very evident in the book, working on that made me think more about my previous research in Indonesia, and made me think about what was going on that I took for granted that I should not have taken for granted. So the book on colonial linguistics, the things I sought to understand were more clearly were the ways that in this case, an authoritarian regime that made as much use of violence as it wished to without any repercussions, failed to achieve what it wanted. It achieved something other than it wanted to. So as I'm working on this book, I'm thinking about the ways that you have an authoritarian regime in place for 30 years. It falls in 1998. And 5 years later, you have something that is to all appearances a fully democratic system of government. Indonesia becomes a full-fledged democracy with a full-fledged public sphere. Now, that may not last in Indonesia any more than other places, but having done the work on colonial linguistics made me, which was, done in that interim period, right? Things were still unclear at the time I was working through those issues for the colonial linguistics book. But if I hadn't done the colonial linguistics book, I wouldn't have taken that as a question. How is it that this massive government project produced results so different from what it sought to produce? Right? And that's, I didn't talk about that today because that's a question for people that's for Indonesianists more than anybody else. But it's a good example of the ways, although the colonial linguistics book started as something entirely different from what I did, it has clearly shaped what I have done in this book. I mean, if you're curious, I mean, I started, my interest in Indonesia came from two places. One was the music and art of the island of Java, which I loved. And the other was seeing how little I could find out about Indonesia and Southeast Asia I was in college during the Vietnam War, and I could find nothing in English about Vietnam. It was all in French. And there was hardly anything about Indonesia, and what there was in Dutch. And I looked at a map and I looked at the populations and I said, how can it be that we know so little about these places? So those two things were my reasons for choosing to go there. Although I went thinking very much of myself as a linguistic anthropologist who was working in Indonesia rather than a specialist in Indonesia who does language. But once I got there, that changed. I became I became at least as interested in Indonesia as I did in how people spoke there. Does that speak to your question?
It does. And it then raises another question that I wanted to discuss with you, which is related to colonial linguistics, which you touch on. I mean, the issue about the native speaker, for example. In colonial linguistics, you talk about how the missionaries were trying to reduce speech forms into writing. Wasn't that, in a way, a production, didn't that unintentionally result in the production of non-native speakers? Right.
Yeah.
Wasn't the consequence of reducing these speech forms into writing, didn't that sociolinguistically result in making people who might have been native speakers of some communicational system into non-native speakers of a particular language?
And the implication being they were thereby alienated from their own language.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
I think I agree. But the second part for the missionaries would be to get the kids. Right? No, you get the kids, and they will, by virtue of that universal human ability, they will acquire those languages natively, and they will thereby naturalize those written representations of speech.
Okay, so then the issue is that they become native speakers of the language that had alienated their parents, so to speak. Right?
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. Let me continue with this. Then we can open up. In the last chapter to colonial linguistics, and you talk about it a bit in this presentation, you talk about the issues and discussions about which languages have been endangered by what, and but you don't talk about this whole enterprise of saving languages. My question to you is, what would be your advice to linguists who are preoccupied with issues about language endangerment? What would be your advice, given your experience in Indonesia and given your own experience in writing the book Colonial Linguistics? What advice would you give them? They may not take it, but it's useful to know what you could tell them.
Yeah. Yes, this is. There is a bit in this book about this issue.
Okay.
So the advice I would give them first is to look beyond the ideology of the standard language, to recognize that what is endangering these languages is not standard Indonesian, but the vernaculars, as I mentioned, is happening in Kupang. You know, recognize they talk in Indonesia about Indonesian as a killer language. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
But Indonesian is not killing those languages. Urban vernaculars, which are becoming regional lingua francas. So until you recognize what the vector of change is, you're not going to be able to deal with it. That's one thing. And the other is to recognize that the ways that young people are speaking are at least as valuable as those of the old people, even though the young people are speaking mixed languages. So the documentation process which goes on has to be or should be done over multiple contexts and multiple communities, because those young kids, the young people, if they don't hear themselves in what's being documented, they won't be interested, or they will say, well, that's my ancestors spoke that way and I value it, but I don't speak that way. Yeah. So those would be the two most important, or let me put it another way, if I may. Linguists have to get over their philological bias. Yeah, the idea that languages come to us as unitary inheritances from the past, and we should orient our work to those. That would be another way of putting it.
Okay, okay. I want to try and get a colleague of mine called Ashraf to jump in, because he has used quite a lot of your work on colonial linguistics, but in Sudan. So it would be interesting to see how the Sudanese situation compares with the Indonesian. Ashraf, where is Ashraf?
In the lower left-hand corner.
Thank you so much, Smith. Thanks, Joseph, It's very interesting. Yeah, in the context of Sudan, the idea of the native speakerness, particularly in the context of colonialism, is that colonial missionaries, through processes of standardization, created versions of local languages. And that again raises questions about who is the native speaker of those languages. The missionaries themselves became the native speakers because they started teaching. So, so again, this links somehow with the project on colonial linguistics. That the question of native speakerness has always to be contextualized.
Yes, that there are times when I agree absolutely with what you say, and it's tempting for me sometimes to say, okay, we know that the ideology of the native speaker is wrong, but what is less clear are what its effects and uses are. And that is why the kinds of things you're talking about are so important, because it can play out differently it's an ideological instrument that has different uses in different places for different purposes. I mean,
yes, because for example, jump in, Ashraf.
Yeah. The second point is that about that some, for example, in Arabic linguistic tradition, the term native speaker is not there.
I'm sorry, what is not there?
In Arabic linguistic tradition, some time ago, Arabic heritage, the notion of the term native speaker is not there. They don't have it. One of the paradoxes is that the scholars who standardized Arabic were not of Arab origin, so on, But again, we cannot say it's also in agreement with the presentation that standard Arabic is equally available or accessible to anyone. It's still strategy. So the absence of the speakerness of of course the concept might be there, but the term is not there. The people, the scholars who created that standard language were not of Arab origin and so on. But again, today, for example, standard Arabic is linked somehow with pan-Arabism, with some forms of nationalism, and so on. So again, native speakerness shouldn't be seen or equated with neutrality, because speaking is always, contextuality takes place in a specific politically charged context.
You make me think of, I should have thought of this on my own, but your comment invites some possibly interesting comparisons between Indonesia and Indonesia, the territory on the map I showed you before, and I guess it would be modern standard Arabic in the Arabic-speaking world. That is to say, modern standard Arabic is nobody claims or is acknowledged to be a native speaker of modern standard Arabic. Yes,
that's true. That's true.
So it would be very interesting, but its use goes across lines of national difference, unlike Indonesia, which goes across lines of subnational difference. But there might be some very interesting comparisons to be made there.
Thank you.
Well, thank you.
Professor, I'm so sorry. Professor Mufwana, you had a question?
Yeah. Thank you, Joseph. It's great to listen to your presentation. Actually, my general reaction is that the scholarship on language endangerment and loss should be paying attention to your kind of research, because it shows that the phenomenon of language endangerment and loss is much more diverse than has been claimed in the literature. And and it is not proceeding in a uniform way anywhere. And in places that I characterize as former exploitation colonies, the dynamics are quite different from what we find in settlement colonies, such as the Americas and Australia.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. And actually, what you have presented reminds me very much of things happening in much of sub-Saharan Africa.
Mm.
In the sense that European languages, first of all, there are fewer endangered languages in former exploitation colonies than in former or in settlement colonies. I cannot speak of former settlement colonies because the Americans are still colonies, whatever we think of them. But also, I'm reminded of a term in Lingala, that when you are in Kinshasa, the capital city, and you don't speak Lingala but speak French, you are identified as Muvila. Muvila means educated villager. Educated villager in the sense that you may have been exposed to all the influence of colonization and have chosen the colonial language as your most prestigious language, but you are not modern, because modernity is not defined by the European language. It's defined by local indigenous dynamics that have produced urban culture that everybody should be able to. And the vernacular of the urban center is the prestigious language. Okay. And local politicians have even learned that. You want to draw the mass to your public meetings and so forth, you use Lingala in Kinshasa and the Lingala speaking areas. You don't use French at all, you would be alienating your constituency. And the other thing is that the variety of Lingala spoken in Kinshasa and urban centers is like what you described there, not the variety that was codified by the colonial administration and by the missionaries. There's nobody's language. People don't like speaking it and they find it artificial. And so even if you are a heritage speaker of Lingala, when you come to Kinshasa, you have to change your Lingala in order to be treated as modern. Okay. So, and the other thing that I have observed, that if you really pay attention, at least in sub-Saharan Africa, to dynamics of local interaction, the Western languages, Western European languages are being threatened by the urban vernaculars because they are losing their status, and people learn it but don't practice the language. So very few people speak the Western, like in the case of, I noticed this in Kinshasa, I noticed it in Dakar, for instance. If you are in a really multilingual setting and you are educated, you can resort to French. But if you want to share something more personal, more intimate, you turn to your neighbor, you speak Wolof in Dakar, or you speak Lingala in Kinshasa and so forth. And so this is really a very powerful call for people working on language endangerment and loss to start speaking of English as being the super killer language.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't apply everywhere.
Yeah.
Western European languages are killer languages. That's not really true when you step outside Europe. And so you have given us a lot of food for thought. Thank you very much.
Yeah. Let me just, one of the things a key element of the empirical stuff in the book keys to the difference between urban residents who grew up in the city and who grew up in the villages, like your educated villagers, because there's a paradox of sorts, which is that if you learn Indonesian in the villages, you also internalize the diglossic norm, that Indonesian is a standard language, it is a literate language, it is totally separate from your ethnic language, because your life in the village and what goes on in the schools and the government are very different. But if you grow up in the city, there's no such sense of difference between standard Indonesian and vernacular Indonesian. So the irony is that when I call them newcomers from the village come to the city, they find that their Indonesian is too good. They have to learn to vernacularize their Indonesian, or they will be like your French-speaking educated villagers, which it sounds like a very strong parallel. And if I can just play off what you said, the idea of French being a killer language, or in this case, Indonesian being a killer language, goes together with a very partial idea of what modernity is. It's a global, it's as if modernity is the same everywhere, right? And it's leaking in through the cracks everywhere in the same way. But if you look at it empirically and at the vernaculars, you see that in fact, it is always local, it is always urban, it is always situated. So what you're describing, as I understand it, corresponds very well with what I found in this work. And yeah, and it continues to be a blind spot.
Yeah, if I can add something to just, everything. As a student of language contact, I'm very much impressed by the power of the indigenization of a language brought from somewhere else, because once the language indigenized has been indigenized and appropriated by local speakers, everybody outside loses control over it. It's up to the local practitioners of the language.
Yes. Well, and in your work on globalization, you've made this point in many different ways, yeah, that it's never only global. There's always something else going on.
All right, I see a hand from Professor Rutledge.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. Professor Errington, thank you so much for this super interesting talk. And I think as Salikulu already said, that there's so many ways that it translates to sub-Saharan African contexts. I just also, what you said, I think a lot of the things that echo so much, one of Duranty's, I think, most important quotes, how a lingua franca, or rather that language, whether a lingua franca or any other language, never has never is neutral, and that how this non-neutral function is paradigmatic foundation of linguistic anthropology. And I just, when it comes to, so I've worked quite extensively on this ambiguity of English as a putative lingua franca in South Africa, which of course it's not. And I try to engage with this really very tunnely view of applied linguists as well, of the status of a lingua franca and as a neutral language, yeah, which of course it isn't at all in South Africa.
Yeah.
I wanted to ask you, because specifically I'm interested in the identity politics that emerge through the usage then of this putative lingua franca. And in the South African context, for example, when it comes to English, these specifically ethno-linguistic accents that are then used, sometimes actually purposely employed in with the usage of English, how they often, let's say, create a context where an individual is trying to assert her or his authenticity. Yeah. And I was just wondering, when you spoke about the generational, how then the young speakers who speak basically the lingua franca in very different ways, or Indonesian, Bahasa Indonesia in a completely different way than the older generation. I wonder if that's still, if these kind of, let's say, ethno-linguistic politics are also at work in Indonesia, where you have people perhaps flagging even consciously a particular accent in order to authenticate themselves. I just wondered if this something.
Okay, I think a short answer is perhaps not, because everybody speaks Indonesian with an accent. In the absence of, that is to say, unlike English, there are native speakers of English. I will attest to that. But because there are no native speakers of Indonesian, nobody can avoid producing speech sounds that mark either their native language or that of the community that they came up in. There is no flat Indonesian language. So when people deploy an accent, for them to switch from one accent to another would not sound as if they're asserting status. It would sound as if they didn't know who they were ethnically. So if I have a Javanese accent and then I start sounding like I'm Balinese, that would just be strange. That would just be peculiar. Where it might come in would be among elites on those rare occasions when English is the dominant language of discourse. And then your relative fluency might become a mark of status. Yeah, if my English is better than yours, I'm more educated than you. I have been in contact with more native speakers of English than you have. And that then could become an assertion of status. But that again is because there is a reference point for English, even if that reference point is extra national. Is that, am I speaking to you?
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, that makes perfect sense. I mean, and when you say that that wouldn't, it doesn't make sense in the Indonesian context. I think to many South Africans, it also doesn't make sense. That's the interesting dynamic that, for instance, one politician, Musi Maimane, for example, who's been, I think very critically been discussed because of an eligible change of accents, different contexts. Yeah, so because of course English close to native accent always speak of privilege, and that privilege then might not want to be, for example, ideally and politically strategically communicated in another context. And I think people have very much held it against him, for example, in that particular case. But thank you, thanks very much.
Sure. No, thank you. Yeah.
All right. So if you have a question or comment, do feel free to place it in the chat or use the raise hand function. I see a hand from Marilyn Martin Joe. You are muted.
Yeah. Sorry, it took a while to respond. Thank you, Joseph. This is really, really very interesting, and your work has been very inspiring over the years. So thank you for.
So is yours. Just saying.
Yeah, so I was thinking all the time about, just across the border from Kupang in Timor-Leste, which has been the focus of my attention, and my partners, Timorese, have written about this quite a lot. I'm thinking about, Chetham's emergence now as the new lingua franca in Timor-Leste is rapidly gaining ground. But yes, a lot of what you're saying, resonates with this story. And it's actually, of course, there are huge generational differences, so that those who are educated through the medium of Bahasa Indonesia over 24 years of occupation, they sort of have a kind of very broad kind of vocabulary base, resource from Bahasa still in their repertoires. But then the sort of older generation, of course, still have a resource from Portuguese as sort of the colonial era. Sorry, yeah.
My phone, sorry.
Yeah, so the rather rapid changes, but there's ample evidence now that Tetum is kind of really emerging as the major kind of lingua franca in the, as it has been, of course, historically as well, but now much more important, and is displacing some of the regional languages, particularly in the urban centers, not just in Dili, but also in other parts of the country. So it was just really a comment on how extraordinarily quickly things change over time. Since of course independence in 2002 in Timor-Leste.
If I have to ask, do you know, is it Catherine van Klinken?
Yes, she's a Dutch linguist who works there and has documented the spread of Tetum, as a variationist linguist.
Yeah, she is reputed to have given Tetum a passive.
Of course, she also teaches Tetum at the university where she works. Yes.
Her brother, who is also in Indonesian, has said, yes, Catherine gave Tetum a passive, which I found funny.
But there's some dispute over this, the orthographic conventions.
Oh, I'm sure.
Yes.
Now, I was in, I got to Dili for a week or so in 2003 or 4, at which point the language question was much less resolved. And at that point, Tetum, to listen to people talk, Tetum was not on the map. It was Indonesian or Portuguese.
Yes.
And I've watched the rise of Tetum. I think this is great. I mean, this is, Indonesian would be to East Timor what, I don't know, English is to Northern Ireland. Yes. Or to Ireland in general, yeah. And Portuguese is the language of the old elites.
Yes.
Neither of them has any claim to authenticity, if I can use that word.
Yes.
Yeah, but Tetum appears to be. What it says to me is East Timorese are buying into the nation, to Timor-Leste as a entity.
Yes, and recent work that we've been doing in Northern Ireland, actually, if you should mention it, there has been massive immigration from Timor, those who got Portuguese passports, from anybody born before 2002 can apply for a Portuguese passport, and that many have come not just to Portugal, but especially to the UK, and especially to Northern Ireland. There's a very substantial Timorese community here in the UK. And a very important link for them is the use of Tetum online. And of course, they organize themselves locally. And so there are substantial football teams, local Timorese football teams that have Tetum names. And sometimes Tetum names, sometimes also regional names, like they might, Fataluku speakers might form a team and use a Fataluku name for their teams.
That is,
football's an interesting space.
Fataluku and Northern Ireland are very far apart.
I know.
In many ways.
In every single possible way. But it is, I think Tetum is becoming very much the language of the, social media context and transnational links and identities.
Yeah.
So just lots of facts to share with you.
Yes, no, that is very interesting to know. I had no idea.
All right, so we have a question from Anna and then Onyeri. Go ahead, Anna.
Hi, Dr. Errington. So thank you so much for your presentation. My background is actually in comparative and international education. And one of the key pieces of this is kind of discussing what it means to compare between nation states, different locations, what borders and border crossings mean. And so I'm actually really interested in the way in which you call yourself a Indonesianist, and what that means in your field, in your space. And secondly, how that framing kind of impacts the ways in which you see language within this geographical space, but also how you see language compared to other spaces within the global South. I would love, it's a broad question, but it made my ears perk up, because it's something that I think, you know, in some of our own work, we're kind of pushing back against this idea of holding on to this notion of the nation state. But I would be really curious to hear more about how you see that.
Sure. So let's see. The term Indonesianist that's given to us indirectly by political geography. I mean, if people ask me what I do, they have categories they want to know about, and one of them is the nation state. I could alternatively, for a while, I could call myself a Javanist, which I did because I focused on Javanese, which is one language of Indonesia. So it's in some ways it's a term of convenience, because I mean, let's put it this way. I spent a lot of time studying Indonesian. My Indonesian is pretty good. I've spoken it a long time, but you cannot really tell where the Indonesian language stops and the Malay language starts. And what that means is you cannot arrive at the border of Indonesia and that's the end of Indonesian, because Malay is spoken along the peninsula of what is now Malaysia. There are varieties spoken in Madagascar. There are varieties spoken in many other places. So I could say I'm a specialist in varieties of Malay, but that doesn't give people a handle for what I do professionally. And the other thing is that to the degree that Indonesia is real to Indonesians, I have to take it seriously, if you know what I mean. With the very important exception of New Guinea, the western half of New Guinea, even in the most marginal places, people understand themselves to be Indonesians. So if it is an artifact, you know, if we do a systems-based globalization world historical approach, and we say that Indonesia is an artifact of a certain configuration of political economic institutions, that may be true, but that's not how it looks to them. And so I have to take their point of view seriously. When I say Indonesianist, I'm thinking about that as well. Does that speak to your question?
Yeah, it does. I guess my follow-up question is, how do you think that framing impacts the ways in which you see the changes of language that are occurring both within an Indonesian context and beyond?
Well, what it does is it makes me think about questions of simultaneity in different places, right? I mean, it's a space-place difference, okay? I mean, the towns I'm talking about are urban locales or places. They're places where lives go on and deal with each other. Yeah, they're the Umwelt, right? The life world is there. But it's very hard to think about these without recognizing that there are a plurality of them, and they're all going on not in parallel, well, certainly not convergently, but in some way parallel, because all of them are framed and engaged in with an understanding that they exist within national space, that is within the space of national territory. So that what people are doing in Kupang is decidedly local, but what they're doing is also deeply influenced and gains value from the ways they know that they are among many others. They are living in one among scores of towns, and they are a small percentage of a very large educated Indonesian population. So Indonesia is the space in which the simultaneity of these things is going on. Does that am I successfully evading your question?
No, that's helpful. Yes, thank you.
No, I take, you know, Anderson is I take him seriously. He talks about the ways that nation states, our awareness of nation states is an awareness of simultaneity in what he calls empty homogeneous space, right? All these nations are in the same, whatever they're doing it within the same kind of temporality and spatiality. But I think that's also true in Indonesia, at least it's true within the nation, right? That what people are doing is enabled and informed by this awareness of all those other Indonesian places where all those other Indonesians are living all those other lives. So that's what comes to mind. So when we did this research, I got the chance to frame the proposal, and I picked 3 towns that were all quite distant from each other, and that were all quite distant from the capital, which is Jakarta. And I didn't put it this way to myself then, but it's pretty clear to me now. It was because of this question of simultaneity, right? What's going on in these 3 places, and how can we see the differences between what's going on there against the background of sameness, which is kind of what I was trying to do in the, like at the end there. Yeah.
All right, and then we have one last question from Oniri. Would you like to?
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Yeah.
Okay. Mine is actually not a question, it's just a comment. And it's really based on what I have heard so far in this forum today. I think that we should tread with a bit of caution when we make certain statements, because I think some of the statements really border on generalizations. For example, when we say that a foreign language is not a killer language, we have to be careful, because maybe in some places it is not a killer language, all right? But in others it is. So we have to look at what's happening in different places so that we can, really paint a correct picture of things and not make certain blanket statements. Where I come from, English is a killer language. Yes, and here's why. Because for some time now, there's been a generation of parents, families, and this is not just 1 or 2 here and there kind of thing, but parents, families are intentionally raising the next generation of children in English and not in their native languages. So you now have a whole generation, or about 2 generations maybe, of people who cannot speak their native languages because their parents and society at large have raised them in English. I am from Nigeria, and in my part of Nigeria, that's happening. Many children cannot speak their language and many cannot read it. I remember when I returned from Scotland in 1994, I was approached by a friend who asked me to teach her children my language because that was the language of her husband. She and the husband spoke different languages. So the only means of communication in the family was English, and that's understandable. But she was kind of worried that the children did not know any native language, and she wanted them to know their father's language, because their father's language is considered their native language, or what you call the mother tongue. And she approached me. I couldn't do it. Not that I couldn't do it, but I really did not want to do it because I felt that I was going to insert myself into something, that I wouldn't be able to handle, because the question was, why wasn't the dad intentionally speaking his language to the children? So, but that's just, a personal example. But speaking about what's happening, many parents, many families are intentionally raising their children in English. And that's being reinforced by what's happening in churches, especially in the Pentecostal churches. most Pentecostal churches are operating in English. No Bible is read in any native language. Everything is done in English. So that serves to kind of reinforce what's already happening in the homes. So you're also getting a generation of people who cannot speak their language or who don't read their language. So I don't blame people or the linguists and so on who are working on preserving or, maybe I shouldn't use the word resurrecting because the languages haven't, actually died. Maybe in some places they have, but in this context, they really haven't, but the number of users is reducing. So I'm not going to fault those people who are now working hard to preserve the languages because they can see what's happening. And I think it's a good thing to preserve languages, even if it's not for communication purposes, maybe for research purposes. So that 50 years, down the line, we can come back and say, okay, I need some, data on this language, and we can find that data, even if it is just for research purposes. Now, there's a new Bible in Ibibio that has been translated into Ibibio, the New Testament. They're working on the Old Testament, but the New Testament, there's a subtitle to it. It says, the Bible, I'm translating into English now, the Bible in Ibibio as spoken today. So it is not the Ibibio that our ancestors spoke that's written in that Bible. It is the Ibibio that's, in other words, it is the modern Ibibio, if I can use that term, modern. So we have to understand what's going on before we, maybe condemn certain people for doing certain things. But, we shouldn't, because there's certain dynamics, certain things that are happening. They may look slow, and we can't really see them, but they're happening. And if they are, solutions to them, then we should at least look at those solutions with an open mind. And, sort of try to understand what's going on. So like I said, in some places, English may not be a killer language, French may not be a killer language, Portuguese may not be a killer language, but in others, those languages may actually be killing other languages because of what's happening. Some people think that English is a prestige language, is the language of social mobility, so they are intentionally depriving a whole generation of learning any other language except English in that context. That's what I have to say.
Thank you so much.
Excuse me, but I just reviewed a book a year ago that talks about the spread of Nigerian Pidgin English, which is very fast. Can you speak about that?
Yes, I can. Again, Nigerian Pidgin English, where is it spreading? You also have to look at where it is spreading. It is spreading in some parts more than others. Nigerian Pidgin English isn't really spreading in northern Nigeria, for example. It's spreading more rapidly in the south. And it's being used right now it's being used by both educated and non-educated people. But it is not Pidgin English that is actually displacing the other languages. It is, what you may want to call standard English. So that's why I'm saying that we should look at what's really happening in these places so that, we can better understand or express or explain, what is going on sociolinguistically and so on. So yes, Pidgin English is spreading, but people are speaking Pidgin English in addition to their native languages. Nobody's saying, nobody's intentionally trying to raise a child in Pidgin English to the detriment of their native language, but they are. People intentionally raising their children in what you call standard English, those same people will actually prevent their children from learning Pidgin English, if you see what I mean. So again, we have to look at the dynamics and see what's going on. So yes, Pidgin English is spreading, but how is it spreading? What, you know, what's its status? How is it being looked at? You know, so I can speak Pidgin English all day, but I am not replacing my language with it. And many people are not replacing their native languages with Pidgin, as many are doing with English, standard English, if you can call it that.
Interesting. Vishna, Phoebe wanted to comment. She wrote a comment in the chat box.
Yeah, of course. Go ahead, Phoebe.
I was just saying how I identified with Nyeri's point that in Ghana, there's this phenomenon of parents choosing English as their language of literacy in the home. And in addition to all the points she made, the school curriculum, which is English-based, also drives this language choice. So yes, in some places, English does seem to be the thing that's pushing local or native language, local languages to the periphery. So I was just agreeing with her.
Absolutely.
Okay.
And just to kind of wrap up, since I know Professor Errington has another appointment coming up, but Michael Scott makes a comparison with Kiswahili in sub-Saharan Africa, also agreeing with what Onyeri said. Buru Sali, I'm sorry, one second. Buru Sali says, also agrees, saying preservation of our native languages is our sole responsibility, as Onyeri observed, otherwise they become extinct. Thank you for the wonderful presentation. And Salikoko Pofana asks, can you please post the title of the book you started your presentation with for Dr. Joseph Errington? And so,
yeah.
Go ahead.
Sorry, just one moment. I will try and do that right now. Hold on. Oh, come on. Where's here we are.
Or if you read it for me, I can also put it in.
It should be. Can you see that?
Yes, we can see.
As I said at the beginning, I did not put it up to make people buy it. It's what I've been working on.
Well, I'm interested in it.
Professor Makoni, did you want to wrap up the session?
Yes, what I wanted to do now was for you guys to announce the next speaker. I think it's Kim who is going to announce the next speaker.